Shavua Tov to all. Thank you so much for joining tonight over Zoom. It's wonderful to look around the Zoom screens, those with video on and those without, whose names I see, just to express appreciation for taking the time and for joining in from near and far. It's so meaningful to me that my parents are here for this learning opportunity. And more broadly, of course, I want to begin by thanking Toby and Ravavi, the teachers of all of us, thanking our Bayit community, each of you, and with gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. With each passing year, I feel more and more grateful and more aware of the special blessing of being a part of our Bayit community, the special privilege and the responsibility to share words of Torah from the heart, to learn together with you as we approach Zman Cherutenu, as we approach Pesach, the season of our redemption, the season of our freedom. From time to time, a gabbai or a congregant preparing to assign or read a haftarah or a high holiday tefillah section will ask me the following question: are we some congregations, many congregations, or most congregations? The question comes from those vague instructions you sometimes find in the Siddur. Some congregations recite, many congregations omit, and it's hard to know where the HIR fits in. I mean, it's always hard to know where the HIR fits in. Remarkably, the Haggadah has very few such questions. For a text that's undergone so many changes and developments over the generations, there's near universal consistency across the Haggadot that we use today, even between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. Very few changes or variations in our Haggadah text. But there is one place in the Haggadah, at least, that some congregations say. Some Haggadot even have it with that little instruction, Yesh Mosifim, some add. Other Haggadot simply assume it's a part of the time-honored text and put it in without any instruction. And other Haggadot leave it out without comment. Sometimes you have to look down to the footnotes or the comments below the line. You might know what I'm talking about. The title of the talk might give it a hint. As I share my screen and we begin looking at the source sheet, we find it here in source 1. It's the bottom of these 3 paragraphs. Va'e'evor alaich va'arech mitboseset bedamaich va'omar lach bedamaich Chayee va'omar lach bedamaich Chayee. I passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, and I said to you, in your blood or bloods live. Yes, I said to you, in your blood live. As we will soon see, this verse from Yechezkel has no apparent reason to be where it's found in the Haggadah, other than it happens to be one verse before the previous verse that's quoted. But it doesn't seem to be a proof text. It's not connected to the prior words that seem to be there to explain. Why is it in our Haggadot? Tonight I want to argue that it's odd inclusion for those who include it, and I think tonight I want to suggest we all should include it, is because in many ways it's the thesis of the Seder night, the thesis of Pesach. Maybe it's even the thesis of Am Yisrael and the thesis of humankind. It's God's enduring message to us through the prophet Yechezkel. B'damayi Chayee, through your blood, live. And what that verse is about and what it comes to teach us in the Haggadah is about the move from victimhood to agency with responsibility. The move from victimhood to agency with responsibility. And so tonight, in a time of bloodshed of so many kinds, nationally and globally, in a time as we've experienced recent tragic losses in our own Riverdale Jewish community, we have to take hold of this message as we approach Pesach, our time of national rebirth. I hope to deepen this message by digging deeper into this unusual pasuk, by explaining its placement in the Haggadah and using it as a kind of cipher to look for the places that blood appears in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim and the stories that pave the path to it, and to find our pathway to growth, from victimhood to agency with responsibility. we find ourselves, as we find this pasuk, in the Arami Oved Avi section of the Haggadah. It's in the middle of Magid as we begin to tell the story through the lens of the farmer in Dvarim, who has gone into the land and brought their first fruits and reflects back on the story that brought them there, that starts all the way with our enslavement in Egypt. That first pasuk which echoes in our ears, Arami Oved Avi vayered Mitzrayma vayagol sham bimtei ma'at vayisham l'goy gadol atzum varav. Perhaps a wandering Aramean was my father, maybe a reference to Yaakov, who went down to Egypt and there became a great nation, started out few in number and became a great nation, mighty, strong, and growing. As is the way of the Midrash on Arami Oved Avi, each phrase of each sentence from that farmer's declaration in Devarim is interpreted and brought with proof texts from mostly earlier sources, especially in the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim itself. And so when it says that we became there, L'goy gadol atzum varav, a great nation, strong and numerous, the Haggadah tells us this proof text from straight in the story of the Exodus itself. Gadol atzum, large and mighty, quoting the farmer's declaration of Arami Oved Avi, and the Haggadah midrashically provides the proof text, Kamash ne'emar, just as it says, Uvnei Yisrael paru vayishretzu vayirbu vayatzmu b'ma'od ma'od v'timalei haaretz otam. The children of Israel were fertile, they swarmed and grew more and more numerous, and truthfully what should be bolded in the English side is, and strong, vayatzmu, and the land was filled with them. So we see, Gadol atzum, large and mighty, vayatzmu, the proof text tells us, they grew mighty. And then we get to the next bit, Varav. And the truth is, the commentaries on the Haggadah ask why we even need this additional passage at all. Why do we need to prove from a different verse, as we'll see, a verse in Yechezkel, that the Israelites became numerous? Back in that verse in Exodus, it says, Paru vayishretzu vayirbu. They grew more and more numerous. Why do we need a separate proof text? The Haggadah could easily have said, Gadol atzum varav, large, mighty, and great, and then quoted the verse right here at the top from Exodus, which has Rav, Vayirbu, and Atzum, Vayatzmu. Instead, in the second paragraph, we explain the word Varav, numerous, by jumping to a proof text from Navi, one of the very few such instances in the Haggadah, one which seems to interpret the word Varav and great as meaning something slightly different from many in number. If the farmer was saying we grew into a great nation, numerous in number, and the proof text from Shemot seems to say the same thing, the passage from Yechezkel seems to change from the quantitative to the qualitative. It interprets Varav as the following, from Yechezkel chapter 7, verse 7. Rivava, that's one of the hooks to the word Varav, Ketzemach hasadeh netatich, vatirbi vatigdeli, vatavoi ba'adi adayim, shadayim nachonu usa'arech tzimeach va'at erom ve'eryah. Great, which we initially thought of as great in number. We quote from Yechezkel, I let you grow wild like meadow plants, and you grew and matured and came forth in all your glory. Grew, vatirbi, revava, growing wild, your breasts full and your hair grown, and you were naked and exposed. This passage from Yechezkel describes not the growth from an individual to a nation, but the growth and maturation of a young person, a young woman. Vatirbi vatigdeli comes to mean in Yechezkel, not you grew many in number, but you grew and matured. The proof text seems to signal to us that our propagation as a people in Egypt was not meant just to be a growing in number, but a maturation, a development as a people over our centuries of enslavement. This is exactly what Yechezkel is actually getting at in the context of Yechezkel, and to understand it best, we have to go there. So we turn to Yechezkel chapter 16. For those who've been slogging through Nevi'im Achronim, the later prophets, with me on Thursday mornings over the last nearly a decade, you know that this is one of the most devastating and depressing chapters in all of Navi, and that's saying a lot. Yechezkel here in chapter 16 tells the story of a little baby abandoned on the day of its birth. Umoldotayich biyom huledetotach lo charat sharech uvamayim lo ruchatz l'mish'i. As for your birth, on the day you were born, your navel cord was not cut, you weren't bathed or rubbed or swaddled. No one pitied you enough to do any of these things for you. You were left lying rejected in the open field. When I, says God, passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, and I said to you, live in your blood. Yes, live in your blood. I let you grow like the plants of the field, and you continued to grow up till you attained to womanhood. You were still naked and bare when I passed by you again and saw your time for love had arrived. So I spread my robe over you and covered your nakedness and entered into a covenant with you by oath, says God, and thus you became mine. I bathed you in water and washed the blood off you and anointed you with oil. I clothed you with embroidered garments, etc. But then things turn in verse 15. Confident in your beauty and fame, you played the whore. You lavished your favors on every passerby. They were his. And the text goes on to describe in lurid detail the unfaithful exploits of this young woman, even going to say, in all of your abominations and your whorings, you didn't remember the days of your youth when you were naked and bare and lay wallowing in your blood. It's hard stuff to read. We meet this abandoned baby wallowing in its blood untended to, and God says, in your blood live. And she grows up to be a young woman, and God comes by again, sees she has matured, and enters into a kind of protector, romantic partner hybrid relationship, beginning with God doing for this young woman all the things that hadn't been done for her as a newborn, cleaning, clothing, and anointing her. And then in her beauty, from that place of secure love and attachment, she goes out seeking other partners. And the chapter goes on to say how she will ultimately be punished by all those consorts. Before we get to understand the application of this parable, what Yechezkel is trying to actually talk about, I want to highlight one thing that always seems strange to me about this passage. Why does God come twice? And why doesn't God take care of the baby the first time? The text highlights this gap by saying twice, Va'evor alayich ve'erech, I passed by you and saw you. God sees the baby abandoned and says, in your blood live, and then leaves the baby to grow up without care and concern, without anyone to tend to her, and then comes by again and sees, and only then enters into romantic covenantal partnership. Why doesn't God do all the things described in verses 8 and on, the cleansing, the anointing, the clothing, right away when God sees that newborn baby? Could you imagine walking by an abandoned baby and saying, hang in there, kiddo, only to leave it alone again for years on end? Permit me some slight heresy or unorthodox reaction, but can we fault this woman in Ezekiel for going after her wedding to look for other partners? She has insecure attachment. The text criticizes her for forgetting the loving care that God gave her in her teen years, but maybe she's traumatized by the hazy subconscious memory of that figure who came to her when she was a baby, murmured a few words, and then disappeared for a long time, only to come back as a romantic partner. While the exact applications of the parable can be debated, the general arc of what Ezekiel is telling us is clear. And in a sense, it makes the chapter remarkable, because it sees that God is reminding us loud and clear that God sees, that we see that God seemed absent in our formative and struggling years. God recognizes that we experienced a sense of abandonment in Egypt, vulnerable and unprotected. That God came and gave us some charge, some message, and then left us alone again to mature on our own, only returning again to take us out of Egypt, to give us the Torah, and to meet us in the Mishkan. This whole framework is reason enough to study this chapter on the Seder night. It's a kind of fascinating story of the Exodus, retold in an entirely different way. But we can't dwell on it for now. I just want to make two more points to propel us forward. So why did God stop by and abandon us, only to come back when we had gone through the hardest and neediest times of our lives, our childhood without a protector? This is the same question we ask a few lines earlier in the Haggadah, when we say, Baruch Shomer Havtachato, blessed is God who kept God's promise, the promise of redeeming us that was made to Abraham in the covenant between the parts, when he was told his offspring would be strangers in a foreign land, oppressed and enslaved for 400 years, but then the oppressors would be judged and we would emerge prosperous. And so we say, thank you for remembering your promise, God. Yes, thank you for remembering your promise. But why did you need to abandon us for 400 years of servitude, or even just 210? I don't have an answer to this question, just like I don't have an answer to the question of why any one of us is left to suffer in this world, even for a short time. But, and this is the second point, and without diminishing the first, I've been a little unfair to God in this chapter, because it wasn't really a total abandonment, as it looks like, in two ways. First, the text diverges slightly from what we might have expected in the narrative flow. When we turn back to this source, from Yechezkel, we see. Look at all these verses, look at all these words in Pasuk Zayin. Revava ketzemach hasadeh netatich. I gave you over to be like this wild plant. But then you acted. Vatirbi, vatigdeli, vatavoi, tzimeach. All these verbs of growth and maturation that the young woman does on her own. But first, Revava ketzemach hasadeh netatich. I gave you to become a blossom in the field. In other words, in between God's visits, the first accompanied by the declaration of "in your blood live," and the second in which God actually tends to the young girl, we're told that God gave her to be a blossoming growth. A lot of the translations of Yechezkel here are passive. I let you grow. Others more active. I caused you to grow. Either way, somehow from behind the scenes, as the young woman takes agency and does all of these things on her own, we're also told, Revava ketzemach hasadeh netatich. I made room, says God, for you to develop. Even while not actively tending to you, I was hovering somewhere. So we're made to understand that even when God feels absent and we feel abandoned, there is an animating force somehow making room for our growth, even if its intimate and imminent involvement feels missing and lacking. And second, that animating force already did make itself and its vision known in our infancy when it proclaimed B'damai Chayee, the charge to live, to take the reins of our destiny, has accompanied us from birth. And so, and I say this tentatively because I don't want to justify or explain suffering or suggest that it's ever worth it. But what I think the biblical text in Yechezkel is saying to us somehow in God's voice is this. Loss is real in this world. Suffering is real. And if in those times of loss and suffering I coddle you and do everything for you, you won't develop your agency or your identity. I'm here in the background. I will create the conditions for you to grow and mature, but I can't do it all for you. You have to learn to cope with your hardships. You have to heed the call of life, even amidst the blood of loss. Your identity has to be forged by your choices and your growth. I can't do it for you. When you come out the other side, and I promise you will be stronger, and you will have become you. How many times in the last 2.5 years have we heard stories like these? A few months ago, on a Motzei Shabbat, we were graced at the Bayit by the presence of Batya and Shai Hananya, and their adult sons, Nir and Amit. Their son, Yair Hananya, was killed in Gaza in November 2024. And they came to the Bayit as part of their journeys across the diaspora to tell his story and their family's story. Yair was brilliant. He was musically talented and curious. He played tons of instruments, classical and exotic. He loved to read from the Torah and to sing and to discover unfamiliar and new Hebrew liturgical compositions. And on his few days off of serving in the army, when his friend called him up and asked if he would join him at the beach, Yair declined, because he was busy at the nursing home where his mother worked, playing songs and singing with the residents. In his Michtav Preda, that letter that every soldier writes before going into combat that we hope never to have to read, Yair writes about the responsibility we all have to lift up life and make the world a better place. He wrote, "This is our foundation, to live in this world with all the pain and suffering that comes with it and to work to fix it. This is our mission." In parentheses, yours, he says to his family. "Therefore I ask you, rise from the grief, from the pain, from the loss, and go out to fix the world while you have the opportunity. Do it. Do not be overly sad." In other words, B'damai Chayee. Through your blood, in my blood, may you live. A Beit Knesset is being built in Yair's community, lifting up his life and his story and his love of song. Our Bayit and some of our members have contributed towards it. No one could protect his family from the loss and the grief or take away their pain, but lifted by Yair's memory and his choice and his voice and God's voice, they've gone on the road to tell his story, to teach his songs, to breathe life in spite of the blood. Their tears have not been wiped away, but they are in many ways stronger than ever before. Sitting there that Saturday night in the downstairs of our Bayit a few months ago, singing with Yair's family and Reb Eli and the Bayit community members that came, and shedding tears with them, learning about a person I never met but who felt like family, I kept returning to the staggering scope of the losses of these 2.5 years. The enormity of the loss of one person, of Yair, is unspeakably enormous. And that's one young man. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more stories just like this in our family, just in these last 2.5 years. And what continues to blow me away over and over is the resilient spirit of Am Yisrael. The way families experiencing incredible loss accept and model that the only way out is through. That there's no protection from the loss and the grief and the pain, the dam, the shed blood and its anguish. And that through that process, Chayee, they find life, they find purpose, and they become a new version of themselves. And they teach us how to live. In some sense, this is the whole story of Medinat Yisrael, emerging out of millennia of shed blood to try to live a better life, a life of justice, a life of tzedek, a life of peace. And the mandate of living deeply in honor of the lives and values of those we've lost courses through our blood as we commemorate Pesach, our holiday of nationhood. And in reading these words of the Navi, B'damai Chayee, I feel called to share a few words with all of us about Racheli Wiener, Zichrona Livracha. Because the story of her death and of her life is so present for so many of us in this Riverdale Jewish community and beyond. I didn't know Racheli well, although I remember her enormous smile. As many of us know, Racheli died after childbirth just a few weeks ago. Her Shloshim is the first day of Pesach. In the wake of the devastating tragedy of her death, leaving behind her wonderful husband, 2 small children, and her newborn daughter, Rachel, I've learned so much about Racheli's lessons for life. The way she took time to express her gratitude to each person in her life, time and again, for their unique qualities and the special relationship she had with them. The way she took Torah seriously as our most precious gift, as our tool for interpreting and understanding and fixing the world. The way she met each person with kindness, patience, and an open heart. And whenever I think about her, I hear the Navi's words. What I have to imagine is her charge to us, B'damai Chayee. Through blood, let's live. As we sit in her inexplicable loss, as we ask why God let this happen, and we don't have any answer. We also hear the voice telling us to live. And that's why I was so deeply moved, and also not surprised, when gently, softly, a family member of Racheli's approached me recently to express a message that her family wants to impart to our community in Racheli's memory. This wish, that even as we struggle to understand what happened, and even as we grieve, and even as we hold her family close, that for those of us on that journey in that stage of life, that we not be daunted or dissuaded from continuing to grow our families, from bringing new life into the world. Because bringing new life into the world is what Racheli would want. B'damai Chayee. Before we return to the Haggadah, we have to understand what the rabbis did with this parable in Yechezkel. In a midrash in the Mechilta, an early midrash, the rabbis asked the question of why the Passover sacrifice, the Korban Pesach, had to be taken on the 10th day of Nisan, this past Shabbat on the calendar, if it was only going to be slaughtered 4 days later on the 14th of Nisan. And they explain, quoting the Pasuk, "It shall be for you a keeping, mishmeret, hold on to that lamb that you've brought in on the 10th until the 14th of the month, and then slaughter it at evening time. Mipnei ma hikdim hakatuv lekichato shel haPesach kodem l'shchitato arba'a yamim." Why do we have to take the Korban Pesach 4 days before its slaughtering? Rabbi Matya ben Charash answered, Harehu omer, va'evor alayich ve'erech, not yet our pasuk from Yechezkel, the other one, v'hinei teich et dodim, because God saw that the time had come for God to fulfill God's oath, God's promise that God made to Avraham, to redeem Avraham's children. But there was a problem. Lo haya bi'adam mitzvot sheyitasku bahem kedei sheyig'alu. They had no mitzvot to engage in that would enable their redemption. As it says, quoting from Yechezkel, we're going backwards now from verse 8 to verse 7 to verse 6. Shadaim nachonu usa'arech tzimeach. Yes, you've grown up and matured. Va'at erom ve'eryah. But you, the young Jewish people, allegorized by this young woman, is still naked. Naked, eryah, min hamitzvot. Bereft of commandments that would somehow enable your redemption. So what did God do, seeing that it was time to go, but that we somehow couldn't do it because we didn't have any commandments to warrant our redemption? Natan lahem hamakom shtei mitzvot. God gave them 2 commandments, mitzvat Pesach u'mitzvat Milah, sheyitasku bahen kedei sheyigalu. 2 commandments, the Korban Pesach and circumcision, in order that we busy ourselves with them to merit redemption. As it says in Yechezkel, "Va'ayavor alayich ve'areich mitboseset b'damayich." I passed by and saw you wallowing in your blood, and I said twice to you, "B'damayich Chayee," through blood live. "Va'omar lach b'damayich Chayee," and I said to you, through blood live. God gives us 2 mitzvot. It's up to us to choose to do them in that moment. When we took those actions, circumcision and slaughtering the Pesach, when we engaged in those mitzvot, when we took agency, we were ready to be redeemed. In fact, we were actually, practically speaking, already redeemed in a sense, because we were no longer the slaves of the Egyptians. Once we took sheep into our houses, circumcised the men, and slaughtered the Pesach, all things they would certainly not have wanted us to do. And so these 2 mitzvot are all about agency and choice and action, mitzvot in which we touch life and death, for animals and for people, in which we even spill blood, but in the context of ritual, in the context of sacrifice, in a sense in the context of giving. And in fact, we know, as is mentioned in the Mishnah and Kritut, that there are 36 things in the Torah, 36 commandments that bring about the most severe punishment if you do them when you're not supposed to. 34 of them are negative commandments scattered all around the Torah. If you violate them by acting when you're not supposed to, you get karet. There are only 2 positive commandments, that if you sit idly by, doing nothing wrong, except that you didn't do this mitzvah, you get karet, the most severe separation from our peoplehood, from Am Yisrael. As the Mishnah says, HaPesach v'Hamilah b'mitzvot aseh. The 2 positive commandments, that for sitting idly by and doing nothing except just that we are not doing them, we're cut off from our people, are Pesach and Milah, those 2 foundational ones through which we merited redemption. When we learn to go from victimhood to agency, to turn blood from victimhood into a source of ritual, of sacrifice, and of giving. At a Brit Milah, when a baby boy is named, we invoke this verse from Yechezkel, Va'ayavor alayich ve'areich mitboseset b'damayich. And then the mohel takes a little bit of the wine and dips it to the baby's lips. Va'omar lach b'damayich Chayee. Va'omar lach b'damayich Chayee. Through your blood, live. So if these 2 mitzvot are so interconnected, and we so powerfully see the evoking of this verse from Yechezkel in the moments of Brit Milah, how could we journey through the Pesach Seder without in some way invoking this verse from Yechezkel? The one that tells the story of taking agency as the vehicle to our redemption. And so we return to the Haggadah. As far as I know, in all Haggadot prior to the 16th century, the midrashic interpretation of that first pasuk in the farmer's declaration, the Arami Oved Avi, ends here, after the 2nd paragraph. Varav, quoting that verse from Yechezkel chapter 7, verse 7. That's where it ends. That next verse, Va'ayavor alayich ve'areich mitboseset b'damayich, and I said to you, in your blood live, doesn't appear in early Haggadot. Medieval commentaries in their interpretations mention it, but it doesn't appear in their Haggadot either. Along comes the Arizal, the great Kabbalist, and in one of his drashot for Pesach, which appears in Shar HaKavanot, one of the compilations of his mystical writings by his student Reb Chaim Vital, the Arizal says a lot of things which are Kabbalistic and largely unintelligible to me, but here's my best summary. There are 2 forces, he says, that are symbolized by 2 bloods that conspire to create the reality of Egyptian exile and enslavement of the Jewish people. To counteract that subjugation, says the Arizal, the Jewish people need to take agency through two bloods of their own, the bloods of Milah and Korban Pesach. And for that reason, he says in source 6, Ulesiba zo tiknu hamisadrim ha'Haggadah pasuk zeh be'emtza seder Haggadah le'al Pesach. For this reason, the reason that taking agency through these bloods makes a change in the universe, which makes it possible for us to be redeemed from Egypt, for that reason, the arrangers of the Haggadah established this pasuk right in the middle of the Passover Seder, right in the middle of the Haggadah. If that line from Yechezkel that belongs in the Midrash of Arami Oved Avi, as we saw, interpreting Varav not as growth in number, but as maturation, if that belongs in the Haggadah, from there we acknowledge that one of the essential aspects of maturation and growth as a person, as a nation, is b'damai Chayee, to recognize the inevitability of suffering, personal and national, and to figure out how to move from victimhood to agency, through mitzvot as one paradigm, through turning shed blood into affirmations of life, korbanot and brit milah, growing forward from those places of suffering. And we see both the power and the kind of uneasiness with this on-the-nose statement of the Arizal, putting this verse into our Haggadah, in a comment 200 years later by Rav Yaakov Emden in 18th century Germany, who quotes from the Midrash and talks about this backstory of the Israelites only being able to be redeemed once they did those two mitzvot of Korban Pesach and Milah. And Rav Yaakov Emden says, I'll read it here in English in the middle of source 7, for this reason, it was the custom of my father, my teacher, the rabbi of blessed memory, the Chacham Tzvi, to say here, meaning right in this moment on the Seder night in the Haggadah, he would announce, and I said to you, in your blood live. And I said to you, in your blood live. And so says Rabbi Yaakov Emden, v'kach anu nohagim acharav. So we follow in his footsteps. At that moment in the Midrash of Arami Oved Avi, we proclaim this verse. Mikol makom, here we see religious conservatism at its best. Nevertheless, lo madnuhu bifnim. We didn't write it into the text of our Haggadot. Because we've never seen it in any prior Haggadah. And so as not to give anyone a chance to dispute its inclusion because it seems to be working backwards, going from Ezekiel 7:7 to Ezekiel 7:6. And so we just leave it out. We say it, but we don't write it. So we see the tension. Even for those who were reticent about including it in the canonical Haggadah text because it was not sufficiently documented, they still see the power of saying it. And indeed, I would suggest, whether it's written in your Haggadah or not, that we recite this verse at our Sedarim, this Pesach, especially this Pesach, and every Pesach. Now, the Midrash we saw in source 3 does something very interesting that we need to circle back to, that will propel us forward into a deeper understanding of the symbolism of blood as highlighting both victimhood and agency, death and life. Because there were bloods in the history of the Jewish people before Brit Milah and Korban Pesach. They weren't mitzvot, but they were stories about the shedding of blood that establish one of the most, if not the most, fundamental principle in our tradition. So let's look back for a moment at the end of that passage in the Mechilta, the one that suggested that it was through these mitzvot of blood, Korban Pesach and circumcision, that we take agency and merit our redemption, proving it through the passage in Yechezkel. And we could have stopped there in the Midrash. It would have been complete. But the author of the Midrash saw fit to add another proof text. Ve'omer, 6 lines from the bottom of this source at the top of the screen. Ve'omer, and it's further written in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 11. Gam at, B'dam b'ritech shilachti asiraich mibor ein mayim bo. You too, by the blood of your covenant, I have sent forth your bound ones from the waterless pit. A beautiful, evocative description of the exodus from Egypt achieved through the bloods of the Korban Pesach and circumcision. But this is not just a further beautiful proof that somehow it was through blood that we were sent forth from bondage in Egypt. No. I think this proof text is meant to jog our memory of another pit, which had no water, from which a captive was sent forth. You might know whom I mean. I mean Yosef. Because as we're about to read, in the one of the only two other places in the entire Tanakh where a pit without water is mentioned, the story of Yosef and his brothers is a story about blood. Let's read it. We're at the moments where Yosef has been sent to go find his brothers, and he knows they're in Dotan, and he's on his way to find them. They see him coming from afar, and they plot to kill him. And Ruvain, his brother, says, Al tishbechu dam, don't shed blood, let's just throw him into a pit in the wilderness. And so when Yosef comes, they strip him of his tunic, and they throw him into the pit. And just like Zechariah says, V'habor reik ein bo mayim, the pit was empty, there was no water in it. Having done that, the brothers sit down to a meal, and they see a caravan of Yishmaelim coming by. And Yehuda says, what gain do we have by killing our brother, v'chisinu et damo, and covering up his blood? Let's sell him to the Yishmaelites, but not do away with him ourselves. And the brothers agree. And it's disputed what happens next in this story, which brothers were involved, and how it all plays out, and which traders were involved. But ultimately, Yosef is sold down to slavery in Egypt. And Ruvain comes back and says, what did you do? And the brothers are trying to figure out what to do next. They need to explain themselves to their father, and they take Yosef's ketonet, vayidbelu et hakutonet badam, and his tunic is dipped in blood. Look at the cluster of appearances of blood in this story. But this story is the inversion of Zechariah's vision of redemption and return. Here it's the failed covenant of blood, the failure to protect your blood, your family, your brother, that catapults a captive out of the pit, not to deliverance, but to deeper captivity. The one that actually ultimately begins the story of the descent of the Jewish people to slavery in Egypt. So what this Mechilta seems to be telling us by adding the second proof text of Zechariah is that the only way out of captivity, of subjugation, the only way out of the pit, is one, not to abandon the blood of your brother, and second, to lift up in some way the covenant of mitzvot. But the chain reaction of bloods that the Mechilta kicks off with the link from the Zechariah passage back to the Yosef story isn't complete. Because dam, blood, appears one more time in the Yosef story, a little bit later. It's the time when the brothers come back down to Egypt to buy rations, and Yosef, now the viceroy of Egypt, recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. So he deals harshly with them and imprisons them. After 3 days, he brings them out and decides to imprison just one, until they come back with their younger brother, in order to prove that they're not spies. Then the brothers turn to each other and say, and we see it in source 9, alas, we're being punished on account of our brother. Ashemim anachnu alachinu, because we looked on at his anguish, yet paid no heed as he pleaded with us. That's why this distress has come upon us. And then Ruvain pipes up and says, did I not tell you do no wrong to the boy, but you paid no heed? V'gam damo hinei nidrash. Now comes the reckoning for his blood. The blood is being reckoned. We bear responsibility, brotherly responsibility for each other's lives. When we don't hear someone's cry from the pit into which we've thrown them, their blood is on our hands, and it will be reckoned. Now, this phrasing, Gam damo hinei nidrash, is not a chance phrase. The idea of the reckoning of blood shows up one other time in the Chumash, the foundational basis for our responsibility for human life. It's after the flood, when Noach's family is preparing to repopulate the earth. God blesses them to be fruitful and multiply, and concedes to them the reality of consuming animal flesh. The very non-ideal reality, we should say, of consuming animal flesh. And God warns Noach, yes, they may eat animals, but not the blood of animals. And then God says here in source 10, V'achet dimchem lenafshotechem edrosh, the same phrase that Ruvain is evoking when he says, Gam damo hinei nidrash, now his blood is being reckoned. It's because God told the first humans after the recreated post-flood world, I will require a reckoning of lifeblood from every animal and from every human. Edrosh et nefesh ha'adam. Shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. Ki b'tzelem Elohim asat ha'adam. Whoever sheds human blood, by human hands and kind will their blood be shed. For in the image of God was human made. This is a remarkable passage in its terse and literary power. There's the phrase Ruvain was invoking. His blood is being reckoned because God tells Noach, tells humankind, don't shed blood. Humans are created in the image of God. We are accountable for every life. I want to point out two things from this passage. The first is that while we classically offer the etymology of the word Adam, meaning the first human being and all of humankind, every human, Adam, as connected to the word Adama, earth, and that is undoubtedly the case for its etymology because the first human was created from earth. This passage that we just read, Shofech dam ha'adam ba'adam damo yishafech ki b'tzelem Elokim asa'at ha'adam, the one that accounts for blood and life responsibility when we shed blood, that passage seems to be telling us that the word Adam is not just linked to Adama, which would be a very appropriate connection for the first humans who were gardeners created from earth, but that this Adam, recreated after the flood, now a carnivore, is actually linked as well to the word dam, blood, the blood that highlights the value of our lives, highlights the potential we have to take life, and the responsibility we have for protecting life, and the accountability we have for life, on which our own lives depend. Of course, lurking behind this story, from blood accountability to blood mitzvot to the Exodus and the thesis of B'damai Chayee, is the first instance of blood in the Torah. The first blood in the Torah is the first bloodshed in the Torah. It's the only time in the Torah where the two elements that I'm arguing make up the human being, dam and adama, blood and earth, come together. It's the story of Cain and Abel, Cain and Hevel. Cain said to his brother Hevel when they were in the field, and Cain set upon Hevel and killed him. And God said to Cain, "Ey Hevel achicha, where is your brother Hevel? Vayomer lo yadati, hashomer achi anochi?" Cain answered, "I don't know, am I my brother's keeper?" And God's answer is this, "Me'asita, what have you done? Kol demei achicha tzoakim elai min ha'adama." Your brother's bloods cry out to me from the ground. When we bring these stories together, we can follow the bloodline. The story of blood and Breshit is a story of being charged with and then failing to take responsibility for each other's lives. Whatever transpired between Cain and Hevel, whatever hatred coursed through the veins of Joseph's brothers towards him, did not justify the fratricide or the casting of Yosef into a pit ostensibly to die. We live in a century. We've lived through millennia, and we're living in a moment in which it feels that Jewish blood is cheap. You know, I've seen very little blood in my adult life. Not since my years in a bio lab in college in which I spent sacrificing mice as part of cancer research. But in the last few years, as every image from around the world comes instantaneously to those small devices we hold in our hands, we've seen so much blood. Blood streaking down the faces of visibly Jewish people who've been beat up on the streets of Amsterdam, of London, of Brooklyn. Blood spilled in wanton violence against our brothers and sisters on October 7th and since, from sworn enemies who glorify the shedding of our blood. Blood spilled on all sides of the terrible wars we've been fighting over these last couple years. And blood spilled as part of the horrors the world around in our too violent, too bloody world. As we've said many times, this bloodshed, in particular the bloodshed against our people, cannot be taken silently. We're grateful for the friends and allies and leaders and governments that take it seriously and try to stem it and stop it. And we protest against those who stand silently in the face of it or implicitly encourage it. No one has taught us that more than Rav Avi. And what we've learned from the trajectory of the blood in the Exodus story is that we must go from objects to subjects, from victims to agents. But in so doing, we must never become victimizers. Gaining sovereignty in our land, the love of our land, of Eretz Yisrael, and our deep bond to it, is never an excuse to shed innocent blood. In these days since October 7th, as we have fought valiantly, our brothers and sisters have fought valiantly to defend ourselves and rebuild our lives, and also long before, but especially lately, a very, very small but growing number, and any number is too big. A very small number of us have been guilty of non-military, vigilante bloodshed. Nobody's perfect. We are far from a perfect people. But the phenomenon of individuals and small groups of Jewish residents in Yehuda and Shomron who have terrorized innocent Palestinians in their villages, damaging property, burning cars and homes, torturing people, and yes, killing. This is an abdication, a perversion of everything our Torah teaches us. We ignore it at our peril. That's why I've been heartened in the last few weeks in particular to hear the voices of my Roshei Yeshiva from Israel in the midst of everything they're facing and going through, running back and forth to shelters day in and day out, of Rav Yehuda Gilad, the Rosh Yeshiva of Malei Gilboa, of Rav Moshe Lichtenstein, the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, of Rabbi Kenny Brander, the leader of Or Torah Stone organizations, calling out in one voice, this is wrong, this is not acceptable. I have to say a few more things. Of course, we reject the vilification of our friends and family and loved ones, the hundreds and thousands of wonderful members of Am Yisrael who live in Yehuda and Shomron, who are vilified by association with this small scourge. We reject that vilification. But still, we can't ignore what's taking place. And for many reasons, I don't think we can rely on this government to take care of it. I never want to add fuel to the wrongful criticisms of Israel and the Jewish people. Lord knows we face a constant deluge of them. But this can't be ignored. There's blood crying out from the earth that we love, and we spilled it. And I say we because the perpetrators in some way are associated with us. They are members of the extreme fundamental messianic branch of religious Zionism. But they in some way believe they're doing what the Torah tells them to do. And we have to stand up and say to ourselves, and say to each other, and say to our leaders, and say to them, this is the antithesis of what the Torah tells us. We have to find the right ways to protest and the right ways to protect. I'm greatly admiring of the members of our community and others who do the work of protective solidarity presence in those Palestinian villages. B'damai Chayee, when we recite it at our Seder tables, means go from object to subject, become an actor in history, rise from our blood to live. That's the promise of Medinat Yisrael, never to shed innocent blood. What I hope we've shown so far is that the inclusion of Va'omar lach b'damai Chayee, this profound line from Yechezkel at the Seder, draws our attention to the symbolism of blood. Blood, life, in the context of the moments of the Exodus, marks a transition from victimhood to agency. And when we follow that bloodline back to its beginnings at the beginning of the Torah, we see its message to us loud and clear. As we become mature individuals, as we become a mature nation, claiming autonomy and sovereignty, we come to understand the power of bloodshed in the context of mitzvah, of ritual, of giving. And alongside it, the deepest responsibility and accountability for the abuses of power when shedding the blood of another. The truth is that blood is so central to so much of the Torah, we can't do it justice. The role it plays in korbanot and halachot throughout the Torah, from the book of Vayikra, where the word dam is mentioned 40 times or more in the first 9 chapters and on. And we don't even have time to delve into this, but we have to pause to recognize the centrality of blood in the story of the beginning of Shemot. Remember for just a moment that the third sign Moses is shown at the burning bush is to take water from the Nile and throw it onto dry land where it will turn to blood. On his way down to Egypt, he's almost killed until Tzipporah stands up and circumcises their child, taking agency through blood to ensure the well-being of her family. And of course, the first of the plagues itself is the plague of Dam. And on the other side, when we're freed from Egypt and go to Mount Sinai, the moments when we say Naaseh v'nishma at the Revelation are moments when Moses takes a sacrifice and literally sprinkles the blood upon the people. Blood accompanies us on our journey from victimhood to agency. And if that's the case, if it's kind of the symbolic and real companion of Moshe's early leadership and of the Exodus itself, why is it absent at the Seder? By which I mean, why is there no symbol of blood at our Seder tables? We have the salt water for our tears, the charoset for the mortar and bricks, the maror for the bitterness of slavery, the egg and bone for the korbanot, the karpas for our springtime liberation, the matzah for our affliction and our redemption. But blood is just as central to the story I hope I've shown tonight. Why does it not have a ritual item at the Seder table? And that red powdered food coloring that you sneakily put in the bottom of the cup so that when you pour water into it, when we say dam in the recounting of the 10 plagues, it turns red, that doesn't count because it's not in the Shulchan Aruch. But of course I'm setting us up a little bit because there is a symbol for the blood at our Seder tables. It's the 4 cups of wine, red wine that we drink. And now we get to the short portion of the Shabbat HaGadol Derasha, where we learn a little bit of Hilchot Pesach. Source 12 tells us, from the Shulchan Aruch in the laws of the 4 cups, Mitzvah lachzor achar yain adom. And the Ramah, perhaps a vintner of sorts, says, Im ein halavan meshubach mimenu. It's a mitzvah to use red wine for the 4 cups, says the Shulchan Aruch. Adds the Ramah, that's if you don't have white wine, which is better than it. Okay, but fundamentally, the halacha seems to be, and there are in fact Rishonim that even disagree with the source of the Ramah and say white wine is not even allowed at the Seder. It must be red, no matter the relative qualities. But either way, the halacha seems to tell us that we must use red wine at the Seder. Why? The first source for this seems to be in the Talmud Yerushalmi. I'm particularly leaving source 14 below the page for a moment, but look down at the bottom. The Talmud Yerushalmi, which says, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, mitzvah latzeit b'yayin adom. It's a mitzvah to fulfill one's obligation with red wine. This is actually in the context of Pesach, even though it's in Tractate Shabbat. Matam, what's the reason? Al tere yayin ki yitadam. Because the verse in Mishlei and Proverbs says, don't look for the wine as it brings out its redness. Ironically, of sorts, this is actually a passage in Mishlei which is warning against excessive consumption of alcohol, saying, don't put your eye on that red wine. Ironic for me because the time of the year in which I drink more wine than any other time is Pesach night. However, the proof text that's being used here is one which essentially lines up the word yayin with the word adom. In other words, to tell us, real wine is red wine. And therefore, if the mitzvah on Pesach night is to drink 4 cups of wine, it has to be red wine. But that's not the only reason. The Mishnah Berurah suggests that there's more. Red wine, commenting on the passage in the Shulchan Aruch we saw above, first quoting the Yerushalmi, because of the pasuk in Proverbs that says, don't gaze at wine when it reddens, alma daha'ad mimut ma'ala v'chashivut. That shows us that the redness is a sign of dignity and importance. That's the real wine. V'od zecher ladam shahaya paro shochet b'nei Yisrael. And also as a remembrance for the blood of the Israelites that Paro slaughtered. So it's not just that we choose red wine because that's the ultimate form of wine. We choose it because it reminds us of blood, of our blood that was spilled by Pharaoh. The connection between wine and blood, at least visually, at least by association, is actually explicit in the Torah. We saw the 3 times blood is mentioned in Bereshit. Cain and Hevel, responsibility for blood and life after the flood, and the story of Yosef and his brothers. But there's one more little passage in Genesis where blood is mentioned. It's in Yaakov's deathbed blessing to his sons, in which he says to Judah, Osri lagefeni rov lasoreka b'niatono, kibes bayayin levusho, uvdam anavim suto. He washes his garment in wine, his robe in blood of grapes. A similar phrase, dam einav tishtechamer, appears in Ha'azinu as well. Wine, the Torah tells us poetically, is grape blood. And so at the Seder we recall our victimhood, our utter powerlessness as Paro slaughtered our brethren. Now you might pause for a moment and say, we know we were slaves in Egypt, we know there were babies who were cast into the Nile, but where do we know that Paro slaughtered us and shed our blood? The Midrash which tells this story, one which is not on your source sheets, but Rashi alludes to it in his commentary in Parshat Shmot, tells a gory story, that Paro was diagnosed with tzara'at, and his magicians told him the only cure was to bathe in the blood of 300 Israelite babies a day. That's what we recall, somehow trying to transform it as we drink those cups that ultimately mark our freedom. But if what we've argued tonight through the Midrash on the verse from Yechezkel and through the story itself is that the function of blood in the Tanakh, in a sense, and of the Exodus story, is to transform us from victims to agents of our own story, then wine as representative of our spilled blood is not enough. And that's why the Or Zarua, many centuries earlier, in 13th century Austria, explaining the reason for red wine at the Seder night, first quotes our passage from the Yerushalmi, then quotes what the Mishnah Berurah quotes much later, but goes on. וגם יין אדום זכר לדבר שהיה פרעה שוחט תינוקות שנצטרה, ועוד זכר לדם פסח ודם מילה. It's also a reminder of the blood of Pesach and the blood of circumcision. Now the transformation is complete. The wine at the Seder night must be red because it's symbolic of blood, the blood of our victimhood, which was replaced by the blood of our agency, the blood of Brit Milah, the blood of Korban Pesach as we left Egypt. And yet the journey is never quite over because, as the Mishnah Berurah said in the passage we didn't get to read, Uvemekomot, source 14 at the end, Shemitzuyin hagoyim laha'alil alilot shkarim, nimna'im milikach yain adom. In places where the nations are prone to spreading false accusations, they refrain from using red wine. The Mishnah Berurah, quoting here the Taz and many others, points out that we live in a world of blood libels, and in a time when the most horrific false accusations of our actions are being made, we put aside our red wine and we use white. So why is this Torah of wine as blood not more central to our Seder experience? I don't remember learning it in elementary school. Maybe it's the history of blood libels, combined with the Christological associations of the blood-wine connection that have muted our appreciation of this symbol at our Seder tables. But we owe it to ourselves and to the message of B'damai Chayee to lift it up again. As we drink those 4 cups of wine, and if you can, they should really be red. And if you're drinking grape juice, it should really be red, unless there's some health or other overriding concern, or you want to be like the Ramah and your white wine is much better. But as we drink those 4 cups of red wine, we remember our victimhood, we remember our agency, and we remember our responsibility. As we move towards closing, there's 2 more Seder night moments where wine as blood symbolism stands out and reminds us of this arc of maturity, the arc of B'damai Chayee, through your blood live. Source 17, which I won't open up the source sheet to see, but we'll email it out and you can click on it, has a link to a remarkable article by Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Ron on a topic that could be a Shabbat HaGadol drasha all its own. The custom recorded in the Ramah, but going back centuries earlier to medieval Ashkenaz, to dip out or pour out 16 drops from the second cup when we recite the 10 plagues, the 3-word acrostic Tetzach Hadash Ba'achav, and preceding that, the end of the Midrash of Arami Oved Avi, which quotes a pasuk from Yoel, Dam va'esh v'timrot ashan. It's remarkable that of these 16 drops, 3 of them literally evoke blood directly. What Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Ron argues is that the explanation for this custom that most of us turn to or are familiar with is the idea that in dipping out the drops, we're somehow diminishing our joy in acknowledgement that our redemption came at the cost of the lives of our enemies and their bloodshed. This is a genuine interpretation, deeply based in Jewish values, but it's a contemporary explanation, first surfacing in Jewish texts less than 200 years ago. The original explanation in medieval Ashkenaz is that we are acknowledging, as we dip out these 16 drops, the Kabbalistically described 16-sided divine sword. And as we recognize God's awesome power carried out on our enemies, we implicitly ask God not to harm us. 3 of these drops in particular carry a painful history. The Frankists, when converting to Christianity in the 1800s, wrote a letter to the Pope in which they perpetrated a blood libel against their former fellow Jews. And they said that Rabbi Yehuda's simanim detzach adash be'achav don't just spell out the 10 plagues, but are actually an acronym for a secret code that Jews tell each other. Dam tzrichim kulanu al derech she'asu be'oto ish chachamim b'Yerushalayim. The Jews say to each other, the Frankists said, we all need blood, just like the sages did to that man, Jesus, in Jerusalem. But the Jews responded by suggesting that no, the acronym, the acrostic, Tetzach Hadash B'Achav, is actually Divrei Tzorerim Kazav, Alilat Dam Sheker, B'nei Avraham Chalila B'dam. The words of our aggressors are false. The blood libel is a lie. God forbid the descendants of Abraham should seek blood. Such a fascinating ritual, the dipping of these drops, and so many meanings. Tonight, I only want to suggest that maybe there's another underlying meaning. Where are we in Magid when we get to this moment, the dipping out of the drops? Well, we're at the end of the Midrash. We've told the whole story of our exodus from Egypt. We're counting out the plagues, and we're about to move to the part of the Magid where we telescope forward to the plagues that were carried out at the sea, to the Dayenu that propels us out of Egypt, into the wilderness, through the sea, to the promised land. But before we get there, at the moment when we're dipping out the drops, we're right at the moment of the Exodus. What's happening now in that story? In real time, back 3,300 years ago? The Korban Pesach. And what did we do in that moment when we slaughtered that Korban Pesach? We did what God told Moshe to tell us to do. In source 18, Ulekachtem agudat ezov, take a bunch of hyssop. Utvaltem badam asher basaf, dip it in the blood that was in that vessel. V'higatem el hamashkof, v'el shtei hamezuzot, and bring it to the lintel and to the 2 doorposts, min hadam asher basaf, from the blood that was in that vessel. Maybe in some small way, when we dip out the wine this Seder night, we remember that we are reenacting the moment in our history when we took agency, the moment we went from acted upon to actors in our own story, the moment we fulfilled B'damai Chayee. And so when we finally come to the very end of Magid and we prepare to drink that very cup, we offer the blessing in source 19. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe. Feel free to read along in the English. I have to say it in the Hebrew because it brings to me the feeling of the Seder night. Asher ga'alanu v'ga'alat avotenu mimitzrayim v'higiyanu halayla hazeh lechol bo matzah u'maror. Kein Hashem Elokeinu ve'elokei avotenu yagienu lemoadim v'lirgalim acherim haba'im likratenu l'shalom. Smeichim bevinyani recha v'sasim ba'avodatecha. V'nochal sham min hazvachim u'min hapsachim Asher yagia damam al kir mizbachacha l'ratzon. V'nodeh lecha shir chadash al gulatenu v'al pedut nafshenu. Baruch atah Hashem ga'al Yisrael. I don't think I ever paid such close attention to the end of the blessing. In the midst of its rich, grateful, and hopeful language, as it narrates what we long for again in the future, joyful return to centralized worship of God in Yerushalayim, eating again of the Korban Pesach, we add, and it seems a little bit extraneous, we've said we want to eat the sacrifices. Asher yagia damam al kir mizbachacha l'ratzon. Those sacrifices whose blood will again arrive upon the wall of your altar in favor. That strange verbiage, asher yagia damam. The verbiage of yagia is kind of the theme of this blessing. It echoes 3 times. Yes, this is a blessing about redemption, but it's a blessing about arriving. Higiyanu halayla hazeh. God, you brought us to this day against all odds. Yagienu lemoadim v'lirgalim acherim. Bring us to future joyful holidays in a better time. Holidays on which, having emerged from the blood of Egypt and so many bloods in our history, having taken agency through mitzvot, having tried to learn over and over again the lessons of responsibility with human life, yagia, we can bring the blood of the sacrifices to find favor in your eyes, a mature nation, a mature people, living through our blood. And why was that verb chosen? Yagia damam al kir mizbachacha l'ratzon? Because it's taking us all the way back to the first time we did it. V'higatem el hamashkof ve'el shtei hamezuzot. Bring that blood to the lintel and to the doorposts. And through that blood, we say at the end of that bracha of redemption, there will still be so much to thank you for. V'nodeh lecha, about all those things. Shir chadash, a new song for our redemption, for the freeing of our souls. A new song, a shir chadash. I've learned from our teacher, Rabbi Dr. Wendy Zieler, about new songs, about shir chadash, that the poems of the Jews of modernity and the Israelis of modernity are their own form of tefillah, their own songs, their own liturgy. So I want to end tonight with one shir chadash, with one new song. It comes with a story that perhaps encapsulates all of tonight. On March 21st, 1997, on the eve of Purim, almost 30 years ago, Anat Winter Rosen, a young lawyer, and her baby daughter, Shani, arrived at Café Apropos in Tel Aviv to meet with Anat's good friend, Yael. At 1:40 p.m. that day, a suicide bomber entered the cafe and set off his bomb. Anat and Yael were instantly killed, along with Dr. Michal Avrahami, while 48 others were wounded. Baby Shani, Anat's daughter, who was in her stroller, was saved, as Anat protected her with her own body. The photo of young Israeli policewoman Siona Bushri carrying baby Shani out, blood on her pre-Purim clown costume, moved the entire country when it appeared on the cover of newspapers the next day. 4 years later, in 2001, Naomi Shemer was invited to a television program hosted by Meni Pe'er, asked to write a song to bring strength to a group of women who had survived severe terrorist attacks and rebuilt their lives. Shemer's daughter Lily tells that the image of the one who didn't survive, Anat Winter Rosen, who shielded her infant daughter with her body during that bombing at Café Apropos, that image of Anat was engraved deeply in Naomi Shemer's memory. It stayed with her. Carrying that image, she wrote the song, B'damai Chayee, through your blood live, building it around a verse from Yechezkel. The song is here in Source 20. Since discovering it, and I thank Tzuri Gadassi for bringing it to my attention, I've been trying to learn the musical version of it, which is sung by the singer Ruchama Raz, who lost her own sister in a terrorist attack. Ruchama says she connected to the song from deep pain, and since the time of discovering it, she has sung it every year in memory of her sister and other victims of hostility. Hamilim ha'atikot notnot bikoach bekolot ha'atikim emtza marpei hem ozrim li lichyot hem ozrim li litzmoach livrou olam yoter yafeh ואעבור עלייך וארך מתבוססת בדמייך ואומר לך בדמייך חיי 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 בדמייך חיי ואומר לך בדמייך חיי. Feel free to read along in the English. ופתאום מעל ראשי נפתחת קשת, מניפה צבעונית נפרסת, מבשרת חיים, מבשרת תקווה, ושלום ושלווה וחסד. ואעבור עלייך וארך, מתבוססת בדמייך, ואומר לך בדמייך חיי 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 בדמייך חיי ואומר לך בדמייך חיי. As we prepare to sit down to our Seder tables, in a time of great difficulty and worry, in a time of loss and uncertainty, of families who can't be together because of this war, all kinds of families, for all kinds of reasons. As we think of our loved ones in Israel and our losses close to home, as we think about the weight of this last 2.5 years and the challenges we face, Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews, the immense challenges, as we hold ourselves to a higher standard, demanding accountability from our fellow Jews to do better and to be better. As we sit down to our 4 cups of red wine and recite the line, B'damai Chayee, that line that somehow found its way into our Haggadah, simply because it's descriptive of our history and our path forward. As we dip out the drops and as we ask God to bring us to a better time, we understand our journey, a journey through so much blood, to try to continue to do what we have done as a people in individual and communal and national ways, through the miracle of Medinat Yisrael, through the strength of Jewish communities around the world, to transform our story of blood from the blood of victimhood to the blood of ritual mitzvot, of sacrifice, of giving, to recognize that blood is life and to value all human life. And perhaps, to move entirely from a time of blood to a time only of grape blood, to do what's in our power to help bring days of no bloodshed, of lifting up cups of peace, shared together around the Seder table, as Naomi Shemer dreamt. Mevaseret Chaim, Mevaseret Tikva, V'Shalom, V'Shalva, V'Chesed, announcing life, announcing hope, and peace, and tranquility, and loving kindness. And in the merit of that, may God bless us, our families, our Bayit, and Am Yisrael, with a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. Thank you for joining. Feel free to unmute. We can wish each other a Chag Kasher V'Sameach. It means so much to see each of you here.
Yasher Koach, Rav Stephen, and thank you for the shout out.
Chag Sameach, good night.
Chag
It was
Sameach.
really meaningful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rav Stephen.
Beautiful.
Chag Sameach.
Good, Jan.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Thank you so much.
Chag Sameach.
Rav Stephen, I also sent you a bunch of related sources.
Thank you. Awesome. Take care, all.